Hey everyone, welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm your host, Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief of iPolitics, and I'm joined today by two excellent guests. I have Christian Vandenat from the Vice President of Impact Strategies, and I have Perry Segaris, the President of Spark. We have a lot to discuss on today's show. It's every week. It's the same intro from me because things just keep happening. But I wanted to start today with a ballot box question. We are going into some very, very, very important by-elections next month. I thought, last parliamentary session, it seemed like we had, two or three very, very important, impactful ones, and these somehow will rival those, as it could put the Liberals in a majority government position if they go at least 2 for 3, but I think they're hoping for 3 for 3 to have that stronger kind of footing. I'll start with you, Christian. Do you think that, the fact that the Prime Minister has now had a fourth floor crosser come in, and now he has the potential, if he goes 3 for 3 on by-election day on April 13th, to have 173 seats in the House of Commons, which theoretically would give him the ability to prorogue Parliament and reset the committee structure. Do you think that if that goes his way, we're not going to have an election this year, or is this maybe potentially a trial run for a potential federal election sometime maybe in the fall?
It's an interesting set of circumstances. I can't recall in recent memory one where we've seen floor crossers from two very different political parties. You have Idlot, and you have D'Entremont, Genereux, and now you have someone like Dolly Begum running for the Liberals, who obviously, deputy leader of the NDP in Ontario. Somehow you have to bring all these people together and build cohesion on what's going to be some tricky legislation. And, we've seen some of that play out already. Will a one seat majority, work well when you have all these types of voices from different backgrounds that you're bringing in together? It's going to be tricky. I mean, I don't think I'd be shocked to see anyone propose that a one seat majority is workable for 3 more years, especially with the voices you have. And then you have Nate Erskine-Smith, who's likely leaving soon, and that's going to open up another opportunity. So there's still a lot of question marks. I mean, the ability for the government to rejig the committees and take a majority on the committees, I think, would be huge for them. Would really shorten the timeline for them to advance some of their legislation and feel like they have more control over the proceedings and what's happening at Parliament. But again, they would need everybody on board with that plan. And it just takes one person to feel like maybe they're uncomfortable with that change to sink some of the things that the Liberals have in mind. So the by-election in Terrebonne, in my view, is extremely important. The Liberals have gotten much better at winning by-elections from the time that I used to work at LPC during the Harper majority years. And certainly they're well capitalized now, and they have a great team in place. And they're going to put, the best campaign forward that they can, in my view. But I still think that, when you're looking at the numbers that Carney's getting in the polls, and you're working with a one seat majority, there's got to be a temptation to say, well, maybe we should just secure this in another election and have a durable majority, because I'm not optimistic that a one seat majority, even 2 seats, could last 3 more years.
I mean, I think, Christian, you raised an excellent point. You bring up Nate Erskine-Smith. He says he's ready to go, and he'll resign once that Scarborough Southwest by-election is called provincially. So then you go, you're going to be in this environment where every by-election is going to be a majority minority deciding one. I'm curious, Perry, do you agree with Christian that even if you are successful, you go 3 for 3, you get into a position where you now have a majority government, that considering all these factors, considering how tenuous that is, considering you're polling at some heights that we haven't seen, I don't know, in decades, the temptation would be too strong to avoid that, and we might see an election maybe later this year or perhaps next spring?
Good questions and good analysis from Christian. Let me start by saying, even after we practiced, Marco, you still butchered my Greek last name that Christian coached you on. Was phonetic. He did. The second thing is these by-elections are going to be happening and decided during the Greek Easter weekend, the one true Easter. So I'll be at home with my family enjoying lots of lamb. The third thing I will say is, I know prognostications are dangerous in politics. I think it's pretty safe to say the PM is going to get his functional, structural majority by winning 2 of these 3 seats. We can talk about rumors of more floor crossers to come, because I do think there will be at least one more. And then, of course, you've already mentioned Nate's seat in the GTA. So I think we're gonna get there, and we're gonna see the House rules changed. I'm not a procedural wonk, so don't quote me on this. I don't think they need to prorogue. I think that's important because it answers the question you asked leading into me rambling on here, which is, I think this Prime Minister has demonstrated he likes to execute. He likes to seek deals with corporations here in Canada, countries abroad. And I think he believes, if you just listen to the words that he says, that it's his job and it's the government's imperative that they do that at great pace. I think he sees an election as a distraction. I don't think, with the polling numbers, even where they are, seductive for the Liberals, the idea that you could pull a Doug Ford, go to the electorate, and get a really comfortable cushion, a really comfortable majority. I actually don't think that's how his brain is wired, based on his actions and based on his words. He has not to date really seen a ton of serious opposition in the House to his legislative agenda. And I don't anticipate that with this structural functional majority we will. Is it going to be a little bit harder to have to negotiate the wings of the Liberal Party to keep them cohesive? It will be, but I think he's going to do it because I think ultimately everybody is on side and on board for his vision and his agenda and the pace that he's trying to move at. So I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but I think that despite the polling numbers, the small majority is going to be sufficient for him, given he doesn't really have a lot of opposition or risk of opposition to holding up his legislative agenda.
Yeah, I mean, both you and Christian touched upon this, but I wonder too, how much do you use those polling results or those polling numbers as leverage? Christian talked about how the prime minister was able to assemble four floor crossers from two different parties, which, I mean, I don't know if there's ever been a parliament that's seen that outside of maybe when the Bloc Québécois got originally created and the Brian Mulroney meltdown years. But I do wonder, if you are in a position right now where you're polling at, just under 50% of the vote, according to, some of the most recent ones we've seen, are you really going to have that much in terms of caucus turmoil, or everyone's going to get along to go along? Because how do you fight someone who's polling at almost 50%?
Exactly.
What do you
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I think the risk of the caucus flying apart at the seams, the way that we saw in 2024 with Trudeau's caucus, when times are bad, is really hard, to keep the team aligned and keep the team cohesive. And when times are really good, it's a lot easier to do that, as Stephen Harper, saw in his strong years of high polling numbers and majority. So I think no, he doesn't have the large majority, but he does have the other important ingredient, which is an incredibly large advantage in not just the horse race polling, but I think some of the really interesting questions that have been asked recently from the nanoses and the liaisons, we at Spark, in our research division, Spark Insights, Abacus, there's really interesting questions that are asking the electorate whether or not they're aligned with how the prime minister is seeking to forge new trading partnerships and new security partnerships, if they think he's got the right approach, the right modulation. I know we're going to talk about this later with Donald Trump and the Americans. And on all of those vibe questions, the answer is yeah. So I think that's really what the PM has going for him. And caucus can read polling numbers. The opposition leader can read polling numbers. And so I don't think there's a big risk in the near term here to having to manage caucus the way that it was a big challenge for Trudeau at the tail end of his tenure.
It's fair to add as well, I would just say, like, a lot of these MPs thought they were done. They thought their careers were over going into the last election. A couple months before that. They owe a lot, I think, to what's changed, in large part through the efforts of the prime minister and his leadership. And so I think that does give you a lot of goodwill to build off what Perry said. I mean, times are definitely good. And I would also add that when we're seeing these floor crossings from the other two parties, it seems like this is a unique moment in Canada. I think that's probably pretty evident. People, I think, feel the pull to be part of something greater, the need to deal with a unique challenge in the history of our country. And I think there's a noble sense of coming together to have a seat at the table, be part of that process. And that is a draw to individuals. And Prime Minister Carney's style, compared to his predecessor, I would say is very different from the way that he's shown his ability to try and bridge some of the divides and be a bit more collaborative and understand some of the opposition areas that are out there, but also see where he can sort of bridge that divide and not necessarily just harden the support that he already has, but look to see how he can broaden his support in a way that's, I mean, when you look at the polling in Quebec alone, it's almost unbelievable. Like a large number of Bloc Québécois supporters feel inclined to vote for the Liberals under Mark Carney, as of what I was reading yesterday in a poll. it's truly something. But I think it speaks to the nature of the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, that's a great point, Christian. And not I'm not going to pump Perry's tires here by talking about his firm's latest polling numbers. But one thing that surprised me, and I made a smart aleck comment on this podcast a few weeks ago, joking that the Conservatives should dub Mark Carney Mr. Worldwide to kind of take a shot of him traveling across the globe. But Perry's poll shows that that's exactly what Canadians want him to do. Like it's something that's overwhelmingly popular. Like it seems like everything he does is something Canadians are getting behind, even something that you know I don't know. In my small mind, I thought, well, there's a lot of risk if you're seen as not being in the house doing the work. But that's apparently what Canadians are looking for. Like, is this just a unique moment to Christian's point? Or is the prime minister, somehow, a political savant here and is able to, be the most successful rookie maybe in Canadian political history? Like, what's going on there? Is it just him being able to read the mood well? Or is it just, is the right guy, right place?
I think it's interesting because your concerns that you outline are the exact same things that I would think about. And we've seen people get punished over time. I think back to the Ignatieff years, and he was called out very visibly for not being in the House very much, as he was the MP for Etobicoke Lakeshore at the time. And I think that actually did play a part in him losing his own seat in the 2011 election. So we've seen that kind of stuff play out before. But again, it is an interesting, unique time, and I agree. Like from folks that I hear and from what I've been seeing, that's borne out in the work that some excellent pollsters have been doing, is Canadians are willing to say we need a different approach. We need to think big picture. And that's really difficult for the Conservatives and for Mr. Polyev, who had this all sewn up. And they're now struggling to find things that resonate with the broader public in a way that might start to tamp down the popularity of Carney. The only thing I would say is at some point he's going to have to show a bit more substance in some of the work that's happening. There's, the job numbers have not been great. There's a lot of things happening out there that, people aren't hiring necessarily. There's not a lot of confidence. People are worried. And I still think that at some point there has to be a sense that Canada is starting to move forward. And Carney has said a lot of the right things, and he's made a lot of great announcements, but I don't know if that has flowed down to what people in their own lives day to day are feeling yet. And I think that at some point there's going to be an inflection there as to whether or not Carney can continue to push that pace forward.
Yeah, and you saw the Conservatives. I feel like they were maybe in the immediate aftermath of the Davos speech, there was this kind of like reflex on the part of the party where it was like, okay, that's great that you're having this great whimsical speech, but how is it going to translate to concerns on the ground? And I feel like they stopped that kind of line of criticisms where they saw it maybe their own polling or just what we've been seeing, that where it wasn't resonating, where there is this idea that no, you got to go overseas to make Canada's case in the globe because we are fighting this kind of global battle of influence and serving, I think to the prime minister's point as a kind of a counterweight to, the big bullies. I know we didn't name them by name, but I think, we all knew he was talking about Trump, also, China, and and then the Russians, of course. I guess, Perry kind of looking at that, to Christian's point, obviously, at the end of the day, affordability is still a big issue. I don't think anyone in Canada is really happy with the state of, their trip to the grocery store or how much they're paying in rent or in housing. So when do you have to make that pivot? Where do you have to start showing up and saying, hey, I know I made a big kind of complex speech about global affairs, but here's actually how I'm addressing these very, very real pocketbook issues you guys have?
Yeah, I mean that's the billion-dollar question. And I don't know that there's a clean answer for it other than to say that for the time being, the bigger priority for voters when you ask them is Donald Trump and the threat of the economic chaos that he's wrought on the world and Canada by virtue of our proximity to that country and our entanglements with their economy for decades, for better, now for worse. And it's not just the economic turmoil. Canadians are smart. Canadians, you don't need to be a news junkie or the 1% of political insiders to know that the world is a really scary, chaotic place right now. And for a middle power like Canada, that and Trump and global economic turmoil, I think, has taken the front burner priority for most Canadians. You referenced that recent polling data from early March that we pushed out. It's on our website if people want to go and dig into it. But there's one data point I want to speak to to your point about what you said on the podcast a week or two ago about potential risk for the prime minister traveling so much, not being in the house doing the work. And when we ask Canadians to rank the most important and what the government gets the highest score on, the number one thing they say when we ask all voters, when you lump them together, 79% overwhelmingly say their number one thing that they approve of the Mark Carney government doing is working to diversify Canada's trading relationships. The irony that Pierre Poilievre had basically banned any of his candidates or backbenchers from going to the World Economic Forum, and that speech that the Prime Minister gave in Davos ended up being the thing that really broke through the filter bubble, really broke through on social media, is being quoted and championed by heads of state around the world. His recent tour of European countries, it came up again and again from prime ministers and heads of states he was meeting. The irony that that's the thing that Pierre Poilievre said was a no-go zone. And then here our prime minister goes there and doesn't just show up, but makes maybe the biggest splash for a Canadian prime minister in my recent memory in terms of getting heads wagging. I think that's really interesting, and that's really something. And let's just look at a province like Alberta. Even in Alberta, the prime minister gets an above 50% score on 22 areas of voter priorities. That's insane. If we were all on this podcast and we went into the DeLorean time machine and one of us said that was going to happen in 2024, you would have kicked the person off the podcast and said, do you have your finger on the zeitgeist? Are you reading the news right now? But here we are. The world is a much different place 2 years later, and you've got a majority of Albertans giving this Carney government, federal government, more than 50%. Yes, we support, or we strongly support what you're doing in 22 different areas, including being abroad, finding those new trading partnerships, securing deals with multinationals or Canadian corporations. So I think it's just kind of a stunning sea change in our politics and where voters are at right now. Affordability is always going to be the Achilles heel of an incumbent government. So at some point, is it a ticking time bomb? Yes. I don't know when you want to talk about some of the economic data, but one recent one, the bad news one that I think you wanted to ask about, which is the unemployment numbers, came the week after a good news one came out, which is our inflation numbers are some of the lowest in the G7 OECD and falling faster than many of our comparator nations. So I think these things are messy and murky, but I think voters are aware enough to understand that the priority right now is hedging against an uncertain America in an uncertain world, and I think they score the PM highly on that right now for what it's worth.
Yeah, no, I wanted to touch about two topics though there that maybe we're going to blend with our economic stuff. Is it did seem like there was an argument made, and maybe it was whispered, maybe it wasn't explicit, that under Justin Trudeau, this was someone who was more, who cared more about how he was seen, how he was perceived, especially internationally. Every time I felt like he stepped on the international stage, the Conservatives were quick to denounce it as some sort of publicity stunt. And that's really, it seemed like it informed a lot of the messaging Pierre Poilievre had around, common sense conservative government when focused on the core issues, not, photo shoots and other kind of distracting international globe trotting tours. And then the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, comes aboard, and suddenly the Conservatives seem to be getting hit for being too provincial, for being too insular looking. And now it seems like Pierre Poilievre is traveling the world trying to pivot and trying to put forward his own view for the global stage. So I don't know, maybe I'm overly simplistically providing an assessment of the past year in Canadian politics, but it does seem like it went from almost overnight from going through a strategic advantage to being, so focused on local issues, so, I don't know, insular, for lack of a better word, to now being a huge albatross across your neck. It just seems like the big criticism that Pierre Poilievre faced after Davos was, what's your vision for a very complex global environment? So I don't know, am I reading that accurately, that somehow overnight the Liberals' biggest weakness became their strength? Like, that just seems to be what the polls are suggesting. Is that a fair read?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing two very different leaders, and they're held to different standards. I mean, and Canadians are voters are reasonable, smart people. I think they see the difference in style and the substance that you're seeing from Prime Minister Trudeau to Prime Minister Carney, and they're holding Prime Minister Carney to a different standard. Simple as that, you know. And yes, part of it is the times that we're living in. I mean, it's completely changed with the second Trump administration and the reality of what we're facing. So that's definitely a part of it. But I also think that even just the coalition of voters that Carney was able to string together in his election win is a different constituent group than we saw in recent elections for the Liberals, and that speaks to the fact that he's held to a different standard. People see him differently. The Conservatives tried to criticize him because he's going on vacation in Europe with his family after his meetings that are taking place now. And they came out and said, well, why aren't you vacationing in Canada and this and whatnot? I think in another time that might have been a bigger issue, but it didn't seem to land with many people this time around. And he's a serious person, and people see the seriousness in his approach. And when he goes to meetings and there's a photo there, I mean, it's part of the purpose. But at the end of the day, he has, in my view, a very clear sense of what his agenda is, what he wants to accomplish. He's determined, and he has that drive, and people are holding him to a different standard than his predecessor.
And Perry brought up the affordability thing, so we'll shift gears because I think it's all going to be kind of touch on everything. Obviously, we had some pretty devastating job numbers come out on Friday, something in the range of over 80,000 jobs lost, following on a really, really poor job numbers for January. So we're in this situation right now where we're starting to see some really significant job losses accumulate, especially in our manufacturing sector, especially in sectors exposed to the US trade. You look at these and you think, housing starts still are pretty middling. I don't know if anyone's really happy with the progress we've seen there. We still don't have much in the way of progress in terms of trade talks with the US. So considering maybe the three biggest issues that you would ask a Canadian about, Perry, you can speak to some polling number there, about affordability, about jobs and the US, it seems like we're not really seeing a massive difference than where we were last year, but the Prime Minister still seems to be enjoying that popularity. So how big of a concern is it that, we are in this situation right now, even though the Prime Minister somehow seems to be enjoying, this unseen of popularity, or popularity we haven't seen of a sitting Prime Minister in many decades?
No, I think the most concise answer I can give, and then we should talk about some of the economic KPIs that you're referring to. But I think that if I had to sum it up, I would say for most voters, what they want to see is the right set of priorities and some evidence of progress. I don't think most voters expect miracles or overnight binary, it was bad, now it's good type of switch flipping. And I think again, Mark Carney, not to belabor the point, but when you probe on what issues do you care about, how much of the Prime Minister's airtime or his government's airtime are devoted to these issues? How do you think they're doing with respect to making progress on them? It's overwhelmingly positive across the board, and it's overwhelmingly positive with swing voters, importantly. So I think the shortest answer I can give is, while the country is facing really serious challenges and the horizon is cloudy, stormy, whatever euphemism you want to use, war in the Middle East, war in Eastern Europe, an unpredictable leader of our largest trading partner and security partner. If a politician of any political stripe, at any level of government, demonstrates to people that the words and actions that they take more days than not are aligned with their priority set, voters are willing to give latitude and a degree of patience to a point. I said affordability is the Achilles heel. Job losses are, I think we talk about them in the aggregate, and it can be easy to forget that, there's a man or woman or a young person who isn't able to find work, isn't able to make a bill payment. It's devastating. And that can only be sustained for so long, on the one hand. On the other hand, I would say that I don't think Canada is an outlier in the world right now with G7, G20, OECD, comparator nations. I was doing some quick scanning because I saw those job numbers and the Twitter, intelligentsia headlines about them. Spain is 10%. Finland is 10%. France is just touching 8%. So I don't think we should just shrug as a country and say, well, it could be worse. But I also don't think we're some radical outlier, off alone on an island. And again, to go back to my earlier point, you don't need to be a news junkie to look around the world and see what folks are dealing with. I think this government and I think the provincial governments are dealing with a major challenge on youth unemployment. I think this is the real sleeper issue, and it's getting worse. And it's trending in a not great direction with more and more artificial intelligence technologies making it easier to delay hiring a junior employee or an entry level employee. I think the big risk to any government at any level is where are the jobs of tomorrow going to come from for young people who are exiting high school, exiting a college or university. The trades are desperate for people, but it does seem like there's fewer and fewer meaningful full-time employment for young people in other sectors, in other jobs. And I think this is the thing that the Carney government is preoccupied with as it tries to attract more businesses to start here, invest here, grow here. And you especially see that in manufacturing, and you especially see it in our extractive sector with the critical minerals and metals priorities of this government, and trying to accelerate Canada as a energy superpower and mining superpower.
I'm just curious though, too, Perry. You mentioned some polling you had. Is that like still a big weak point for this Liberal government? We saw in the run up to the last election a lot of discussion about how the Liberal coalition had changed dramatically, and younger voters were less inclined to back them. Considering youth employment is still much higher, are we still seeing that generational divide where older voters who maybe bought their homes a decade or two earlier, who aren't feeling that same sort of housing insecurity or job insecurity, where they're much stronger in the Liberal camp than younger people who are facing headwinds seemingly on every different direction when it comes to housing, jobs, affordability? Is that what we're still seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, what's different is we're not seeing the younger voter demographic as seized and excited about Polyev as they were in 2024. I mean, Pierre Polyev and the Conservatives, it was a routing, which was a complete sea change from Justin Trudeau 2015 wave of millennial voters, young millennial voters, to 2024, where that entire age bracket, being hyperbolic, but a significant chunk of it had left the Liberal Party. What you're seeing now is across every age demographic, they are overwhelmingly saying they strongly support or somewhat support the Mark Carney Liberal government. What's different is the priority set and the issue set. And so for the younger demographic, what we see when we ask people, what's important to you? It's a lot more folks sharing anxieties around housing. I think often housing is a big umbrella, and what tends to get focused on is low income housing. That is not what we see. When we probe on this, it's middle market housing, income accessible middle market housing in urban centers where young people are living and want to keep living because that's where their friends are, that's where their families are, that's where they're in school or coming out of school. This is the big gap, and this is what they care about and want to see action on. And at some point, provincial and federal governments are going to need to deliver on that. As you say, housing starts are still kind of woefully underwhelming. The older demographic breakdown, when we probe on it, it tends to be a lot more concerned with the state of the world, the economy at large, our healthcare system, so that people can age and have quality years, not just a lot of years. And so this tends to be what we see with the older demographic break.
One thing that I would add as well is, I think that voters and Canadians can see that there are certain things that the government can control and certain things they can't control. There are headwinds that we're facing that are not going to be solved overnight. I think Perry's absolutely right. And there are things that the government more directly has levers available to them, in how it distributes money and how it moves projects forward. And certainly the Prime Minister has talked about that. But I do think the Conservatives raised some good points on this as well. We look at the high-speed rail line, for example, that is being proposed. It's something that's been worked on now for many, many years in different iterations. I believe the government is targeting shovels in the ground in about 4 to 5 years' time. That's a legitimate kind of critique as to this is a nation-building project. We've done a lot of work on it. Why are we waiting 4 more years to employ people and do some nation building and do something that has a lot of net benefits for the country and for travel and the economy and the environment and what have you? And I think that those are the things that the Prime Minister and his government have to look at. The bullshit meter for voters to say, well, I'm not buying that we need to wait 4 more years, and that is the fastest you can expedite a nation building project. That's the kind of stuff that I think they have to start to show results on. And I would just add, when it comes to the home building side of things and construction, I mean, I work with a lot of construction industry associations in Canada and private construction companies. There have been shortages of trades, but not so much of an issue if you're not building. And, right now, for example, in Toronto, you're not building a lot of new multi-residential high rises right now. The market's just not there. Part of that is because of the economy, but there needs to be an opportunity for the government to ensure that the construction sector can be a big part of the economy and hiring and good jobs, especially in this painful period that we're in. But there has to be certainty for the industry. The governments have to work together provincially, federally, municipally to project out those projects, to fund them, to say we're going to expedite things where we can. So there has to be a bit more of a role to play, in my view, from the federal government to say that we're taking this seriously and we're really going to expedite things in a way that Canadians feel will actually be expediting things. And I think that's where some of the struggle is. Carney is saying a lot of great things about pipelines and saying a lot of great things about other projects in critical minerals and whatnot, but we need to start to see an ambitious plan to start to build.
And
Yeah,
one thing
Christian, you don't know this. I was just going to say, Marco, high speed rail is my trigger. You have no idea when you mentioned that as an example. I think we should have had it 10 years ago. We've been talking about it for my entire adult life and adolescent life in Ontario and Quebec. And when I saw that 2029 date, I was pretty disappointed and pretty stunned. So I'm with you. I think that example is a good example of where the vibes eventually have to translate into pace, not just action, but pace. And the prime minister talks about pace. I think the biggest challenge is getting his cabinet and getting the machinery of government and getting other levels of government to move at the pace that I think he has a desire to move at. But it's hard to turn a big ship like a
So,
federated government.
So I gotta ask you, Perry. This is a bit too maybe inside Ottawa, but where would you put the station in Ottawa? Would you put it downtown, or in the Senate building that's currently being used, or the old train station, or would you move it somewhere else?
I mean, if I had a magic wand, I would put it downtown in the
There you
original
go.
train station in the
You've
old.
got my vote.
Yeah, that's my short answer. And you know what I would do, because it's a lovely winter blast outside. I'd bury it in a tunnel so that you didn't have. This is really inside Ottawa now, so that you didn't have the train breaking every 3 weeks because of a cold snap or too much rain.
I think that just happens with our LRTs. I think a high speed train would be fine. You talked about both of you guys have kind of mentioned the prime minister and the need to eventually address these concerns and how the words were going to have to meet the action. You also talked about how Pierre's kind of Pierre said Poilievre's losing some steam in the polls. But one thing I was really struck about when back in 2024 was Poilievre was talking a lot about how young people, it wasn't just housing's too expensive or it was about how they feel hopeless. They feel like they're going to be stuck living in their parents' basement their whole lives. Christian, you talked about how housing starts in Toronto are just totally in the ground. But we've also seen there's a lot of condo inventory there. So I don't know how much of it is something where that idea that this next younger generation is not going to have that opportunity to buy that house with the white picket fence and have that stable career that they're able to work 9 to 5 and have a reliable income. Like how much of that does play into some of these decisions where it's the prime minister has to go above and beyond and not just say, oh, I'm creating jobs here, but I have to make a case to younger Canadians, especially that lifestyle that you've seen your parents or your grandparents enjoy, we can still have that in Canada here. Or am I just overthinking here and kind of, maybe drinking too much from the Poilievre Kool-Aid back in 2024? Because it did seem like he was making the case that hope was lost. And that was one of the biggest, most concerning things we're seeing amongst younger people in Canada, that it's not so much that, oh, there is a house available or you could buy a condo. Or you could work, as an Uber driver. It was, you're not going to enjoy a life like your parents or your grandparents. And that's really depressing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and it is an issue. I mean, the Conservatives pushed the pace on a lot of the key issues that became election issues, and Carney did a pretty good job in embracing some of them. My sense is that young voters have started to drift back towards the Liberals under Carney. Perry would probably have a better sense of this in the polling, but I hear it from individuals and from what I've been reading and some of the analysis that's been out there is that what he's doing is resonating. I think the greater threat that we're facing is part of that as well. And there have been a couple of signs of, I don't know if you'd call it good news. I mean, rents have definitely improved a bit in Canada as a result of some of the changes on some of the immigration policy that we've started to see bear out, as well as the economic headwinds. So, we are seeing some of the things that come with those, and whether that's good or bad. I mean, it's good if you're looking to get a better deal on your rent, and certainly many cities are starting to see that some of the lowest rents in a couple of years now. So that's definitely encouraging, but it doesn't solve the problem that we're facing a lack of people building more housing, and that's going to continue to be a problem. I think the Prime Minister is very aware that he needs to court the support of young Canadians who are feeling like things are hopeless. And things are hopeless for a lot of young Canadians. Hundreds of thousands of Ontarians can't find a job between the ages of 18 to 24, as Perry was saying. And if you can't find a job and you're stuck at home and you don't see a future, you don't see what path you could be taking, all of these things start to cascade, and then you've got costs potentially of education that you have to pay off and other things like that. So I think the Prime Minister sees himself as this grand vision sort of leader for Canada. And part of that has to be understanding what the future means for young Canadians. And so absolutely, it's something that he has to be focused on. Right now, Polyev does an excellent job of communicating to young Canadians. And he's shown that in the last election, obviously, he was able to garner a lot of their votes. But I think that that's not a given for the next election. And I think that Mark Carney can absolutely continue to make a play to say that he's the best person positioned to make Canada a country for young people.
What do you think, Perry? Do you think the Prime Minister needs to present a compelling, alternative vision, especially focused for those concerns, those very deep concerns that young Canadians face?
Yeah, two things. One, on this topic of younger Canadians and call it the sub 35 vote. First, let's give credit to Pierre Poilievre. Mark Carney does not have a monopoly on good ideas. Pierre Poilievre had many good policy ideas in the last couple of years. I think part of the challenge for Mr. Poilievre being in opposition and having a prime minister that's a right of center prime minister is he's been yoinking some of the good ideas. And so, Pierre Poilievre built a movement and a narrative largely embraced by young people, but all voters across demographics were resonating with this idea that it was Justin Trudeau that was the reason for what ailed them and what ailed Canadians. And that worked great when Justin Trudeau was the prime minister. But the moment he wasn't, and you had Prime Minister Carney doing what Pierre had asked for 2 years, axe the tax. And then more recently, great slogan, a great tagline, jail not bail. What did the PM do? The Prime Minister moved ahead with, a bail reform. So I think on a number of fronts, as Pierre Poilievre proposes these good ideas that I think have broad-based support in the electorate across different demographics, socioeconomic, geographic demographics, you see a prime minister in Mark Carney who's willing to go, yeah, you're right, and take them. I mean, but Pierre has had a lot of other ones that I think have resonated with many voters, including young voters, holding back funding for municipal governments who were not going to get with the program on zoning higher density and specifically near federal transit, projects that receive federal transit money. I think things like this really resonated with younger voters, and Trudeau government, it wasn't something they were willing to do while they were in power and had the opportunity to steal, borrow, whatever you want to call it, some of those ideas. In Mark Carney, I think you have seen him adopt some of those, and it has neutralized a little bit of the frustration, anxiety, anger from the younger vote. And then the second part of what I said earlier, to just bang it home, it was, I don't know if we can swear on your podcast, but you had a lot of, right? There was a lot of fuck Trudeau bumper stickers. And then all of a sudden, if your movement is built around that and that guy goes away, it's not an enduring argument to any voter bloc of why you, and why you'd be a better approach. I think Pierre Poilievre knocked it out of the park in terms of grabbing attention, speaking to a younger voter demographic to get their attention on what the issues were and what the problems were. I think the struggle has been, I've got a better mousetrap that the Liberal Party under Mark Carney is unable or unwilling to deliver on.
And sorry, we'll go to our last topic in a second, but I did want to get both of you on this because, Perry, you brought up the point of how the housing issues are very, very acute for, obviously for everyone, but there hasn't like it seems like a lot of our discussion, a lot of the policy proposals being brought forward by various governments, not just the federal one, seem to be focused on affordable units, non-market housing, not really kind of addressing those concerns that, people who middle income Canadians. So I'm just wondering, when do we need to see a shift there, and how much is that going to hurt, any government, not just, the federal Liberals? I feel like even in Ontario and BC are probably the markets where it's the most, acute, but it seems like the policies bringing forward, we're going to help build more affordable housing. Maybe I'm just, opining here, but it does seem like most Canadians who are struggling with these housing issues are, certainly can pay for market rates if they made sense, if they were, seemingly brought back down to earth. Like, where's the tension there?
It's a really interesting topic in general. I mean, at the end of the day, unless you feel like there's a change in the region that you're looking for to buy a home or rent an apartment or whatnot, then all of the rhetoric that you hear politically, I mean, there was so much in the election campaign. And how many homes did Pierre Poilievre build when he was part of the Harper government? How many homes did the Liberals build? Everyone's throwing numbers out, and who's believable on the topic, right? It's really up to voters to kind of get a sense of whether or not they felt there was a difference. Obviously, I think that it's fair to say that especially in the last few years of the Trudeau government, trending in the right direction, and he tried to say everything under the sun, and it just didn't resonate with people. And part of the shift that Pierre capitalized on with young people. But at the end of the day, it can't just be piecemeal. I think there has to be a larger approach, bigger picture thinking than just looking at saying we're going to build more co-ops here, we're going to do a little tinkering here and there. There has to be opportunities for people to see that the actual market is starting to change, and that hasn't happened yet. I mean, I don't feel like that's happened yet. And certainly, it's something that, housing is a key economic driver of this country, but it's also a means for people to live and feel like they can continue on their careers, start a family, all of those things that are very important. It's absolutely an issue that we still have to address. There's a report this week that Doug Ford is looking at removing the provincial portion of the HST on all new home purchases, not just for first-time home buyers. It's a $2 billion commitment if it does come to pass. I mean, that's big. That's a big priority. Big commitment in a province where they don't have a lot of money to spend right now. So what is the Carney government going to do? I remember when the Trudeau government came out with their first-time home buyers tax program, and in the first iteration of that program, a minuscule number of Canadians actually took advantage of it. They were creating these little boutique programs that no one actually fully grasped or understood how it applied to them, or the rules were set so stringently that in any of the major metropolitan areas, you didn't qualify for them anyways. And so we have to stop thinking like that, because that's not going to change the big problems in housing. I think we have to start thinking more broadly, and certainly the federal government has a role to play there.
Yeah, Kristen brings up a great point. I forget the exact numbers, but there was this program put in place where the government would basically help you with your down payment. But when you sold your house, you had to pay the government back. And I remember it got like basically zero pickup. And I was speaking, I think, with Ian Lee from Carleton. He said, well, most people in that situation where they're maybe $10,000 short of a down payment are going to go to their parents.
They're like, no, thank you. Yeah.
It's like, listen, I've got to pay that back. So I don't know. What do you make of that point, Perry? Because I think it's a really resonant one that, on these issues, you can't just, tinker around the edges. You do need to go, a bit more bolder and, maybe following, a GST removal. Maybe that's the way to go if you're going to follow Doug Ford's path with the HST.
Yeah, I mean, I think Christian nailed it. The only thing I might add is a pet peeve kind of hot take that I think the provinces have got away with murder on the topic of middle market housing over the last couple of years. I think it's a combination of the Trudeau government needlessly took on ownership, if I can refer to it that way, of something that is overwhelmingly provincial area of responsibility and jurisdiction. I think the federal government has levers. They are not as big as the levers at the disposal of municipalities and the provinces. And it's not I'm not a politician, so I get to say that. I get that it's not a satisfying thing to be told by a federal politician, go talk to your premier or your MPP. But overwhelmingly, I do think that there needs to be a bit of a reorienting and a reset back towards setting an expectation, voters and stakeholder groups setting an expectation with their municipal governments and provincial governments to make it more attractive, reduce friction, reduce regulatory barriers to getting homes built in this country. I mean, it's complex, it's multifaceted. Christian's point is a good one that he raised earlier. We can get more people in the trades, but if no one's building homes, We've solved for one issue that happens when the demand is there, but we haven't solved for other parts of that puzzle, the corner pieces, if you want to call them that. So that's a long way of saying I think for the federal government, the Mark Carney government, they need to have something to say on not just low income housing and the mandate of CMHC, but middle market housing and what they can do. But they should be using the power of the bully pulpit and their convening power that they have, I think, to incentivize and encourage premiers to meet them or match them on programs, funding envelopes, creative ideas that, to Christian's point, don't just tinker around the edges, are not boutique, but are broad based, easy to understand. The more complex a program is, the more hoops you have to jump through, the lower the uptake at the end of the day. And it might be good PR, but it's bad policy.
And shifting gears, I just want to touch upon the fact that CUSMA talks are starting to heat up. Well, I should say the start of the review of CUSMA. We're getting into the time where this, the rubber hits the road, and we're starting to really kind of start with the formal talks around this deal. Obviously, a lot is at stake. It was the defining issue, or one of the defining issues of the last election campaign. Mark Carney got pressed on this issue this past weekend when he asked, whether he failed to deliver the deal he promised to Canadians. He shot back saying, I said we got the best deal possible, and we do have the best deal right now. I hate to ask a really simplistic question because we all know what's at stake. Almost everything, our whole economy is tied to the U.S. But is that message that the Prime Minister seems to be suggesting that right now we didn't take a crappy deal from the U.S. So even though we don't have, our pen to paper on some deal in the Oval Office, where we are right now is a better position. Is that going to have any resonating factor with voters, or do we want to see some substantial shift, considering A, it could be much worse, B, Donald Trump, who knows what he's going to do with any deal? Like, is it really important to get a deal, or is it more important to, I don't know, just, maybe keep things as they are right now, despite the limitations we have?
I mean, I would say that timing is super key on this. I mean, we went through a period where Carney kept saying in 30 days we'll have something positive to announce, and then he, extracted little concessions. He rescinded the digital services tax, and in 30 days we'll have another great little announcement coming. Something's coming, and then by the summer of last year it was like we're not going to do these little windows anymore, and things became less clear. At the end of the day, there is some benefit, I think, strategically to waiting out the machinations of what's happening in the U.S. And we're seeing the Supreme Court, at least stand up somewhat against tariffs. Not that that's the be all end all, but it's something. You're seeing the U.S. House of Representatives starting to be a bit more supportive on both sides of the political aisle against tariffs, and support of free trade for Canada and the economic impacts of not doing so. And obviously the president's grip is also starting to change. He's going into the last few years of his presidency, and people are starting to defy him more, and people are feeling more emboldened. Especially we're seeing that in the Senate and the House. And all of this is good for Canada, in my view. The question then becomes, how much longer can you kind of tell Canadians, oh, shh, don't say anything, let's just say we have a good deal, so let's not talk about it. Let's all just, it's not a good communications strategy. And Perry's talking about communications. The opposition can sit back the whole time and say, well, what are you doing? Your strategy is just, let's not say anything and hope that things are okay, right? I mean, that does seem to be a bit of the strategy right now. And yes, Canada has a more favorable tariff rate than other countries, and CUSMA captures a lot of the goods that are being shipped, but this is not a long-term strategy. And so at some point the question has to go back to then timing being everything. When is the right time to start to push for a more substantive negotiation? Our firm at Impact, we work with a lot of organizations like the Vehicle Manufacturers Association, the Automobile Dealers Association, a lot of cross-border organizations that are speaking up. And one of the things that we've noticed has changed in the last few months, a lot more US organizations are starting to speak up in the US to say this is bad. And they're not as fearful to say, President Trump, this is the wrong approach. We're seeing that, like I said, from more people in Congress, but we're also seeing that from trade associations, stateside, other organizations that in the first few months of the Trump administration's second term, they probably would have sat back, or they have sat back and didn't want to speak up. So those are all things that are helping towards, I think, Canada having a stronger case in these discussions. But the timing has to be, sound for Canada to press its advantage. And I think we're starting to get to a better place on that. Carney rightfully can be attacked by Pierre Poilievre for saying that he'd be the best to negotiate a deal and kind of kept things quiet, and things have unraveled a bit in some cases. But at the same time, I do think it's fair to say that Canada is in a more advantageous position than other countries, rather, and certainly, the strategy hasn't been a total disaster. So I think that there are a few things for him to keep in mind as he looks at the next phase of these negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Christian, that even if, the Prime Minister wants to talk about how we're in a stronger position than maybe some other countries because we have a lower, overall tariff rate, for some industries, it's basically like life or death, right? For the steel producers, for auto manufacturers. You can't necessarily gloss over that. And those are big sectors that, contribute to a lot of jobs, especially in places like Ontario. But, I guess, to bring you in, Perry, what do you read about the messaging that the Prime Minister has kind of had on this issue? It was a huge part of last April's election. And I agree to disagree that, I don't think he ever said, I'm going to necessarily have a deal with the US, but he definitely said I would be, to Christian's point, I was the best suited. And the idea was that Pierre Poilievre wasn't, because he was going to run down and sign any deal with the Americans, whereas I was going to stand up and make sure we got the best deal. So now it seems like the rubber's going to hit the road here. Here we go. Kuzma talks are starting up. What's the game plan for the PM?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't pretend to know exactly what's in the Prime Minister's mind, but I'll tell you what I observe. But before I do that, let me back up. And a piece of advice I might give to the folks who are leading the communications for the Prime Minister would be to try to dial down the rhetoric around these Kuzma negotiations and just bring a dose of facts to the Twitterverse and the headlines. This July 1st review date is very vague, right? What it asks the parties to the agreement to do is to convene, to come together, to decide whether or not they want to walk through one of three doors. Door number one is renew the thing. We get 16 more years as is, with 85% roughly of our economy covered by this free trade deal. Number two is withdraw entirely. Very unlikely, highly unlikely, would be devastating for Canada, would be devastating for American agriculture, American border states, American manufacturing, right?
In an election year, I might just add, because it's an election year in a couple of months' time.
You're reading exactly where I'm going, Christian, which is, and the final thing is, the final scenario before getting to Christian's point he just made is door number three is signal non-renewal, non-withdrawal, which just means that we would keep going and meeting every July 1st for the next 10 years. So these are the three scenarios. And I don't think this is a one and done meeting. I think these are going to drag on for months. And the longer it drags on, these meetings with Janice Charette, Dom LeBlanc, and the larger team, I think the advantage goes to Canada for some of the reasons that Christian has raised. You've got midterm elections bearing down on the Republicans happening in November, which in politics is like the blink of an eye. It looks bad right now. You have an American public decidedly against these tariffs in general. 51% of Americans in an Angus Reid poll said they strongly disapprove of tariffs on Canada. You've got the emboldened corporate world in America. Who would have thought Costco is leading the resistance, and taking the American government not just to the court of public opinion, but to actual court. You have a Supreme Court that found its lion courage. And so more and more and more as time drags on, as this war in the Middle East gets worse for Donald Trump and costs billions, tens of billions when it's all said and done, whoever knows when that is going to be. I think the longer these negotiations drag on with no real decision, the more bargaining power, the more leverage we will have as a country. So what's the game plan? I think the game plan is probably running a two-track strategy, which is try to be friendly and manage the Trump administration, if I can put it that way. No hard-edged, bombastic, antagonistic public statements on supply managed sectors, as a for instance, or one of the other big issues for Donald Trump is the access that the Chinese market has in Canada, and using it as a backdoor into the United States. So I think the more we can rag the puck, Donald Trump likes talking about hockey, and the more we can rag the puck on these negotiations, the more we're able to let the domestic politics in America play out while the Carney government does what it's very obviously and very clearly doing, we can all see on the second track, which is get more deals done with other middle powers with EU member states, with the Japanese, with the Koreans, with the Taiwanese, yes, also with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Australians. And I think we've seen that going at pace. I think there's a lot more to come from what I understand in terms of the PM's travel agenda and some of these upcoming international conferences that repeat on the calendar and that we know are going to be featuring more of these attempted deal-making situations.
Yeah, the trap style of political negotiating, just play defense and try to get opportunities off the rush. I don't know, Christian, do you think Canadians will buy into that strategy if the Prime Minister signals it explicitly or implicitly that I'm going to kind of pull, I'm going to pull my shots a bit here. I can't take every opportunity to slam the president when he says something outrageous because I don't want to have a fight with him because that's probably our best course of action? Or do you think people are going to want him to be a bit more bombastic, like you see with Doug Ford taking every opportunity to kind of, every political or public opportunity to go on US TV and kind of take the fight to the president?
Yeah, I mean, give Doug Ford credit. I still hear the odd musing from the Commerce Secretary or someone complaining about alcohol not being on the store shelves at the LCBO. So, I mean, certainly some of the moves he took for a provincial premier, certainly registered up to the level of some of the senior decision makers in the U.S. government. But I do think for Mark Carney, the approach is not to take that approach, and I think he's been exercising that and his restraint. I think that he's a much more calculated, reserved individual when it comes to these high pressure situations and his reactions in lifetime. I think that comes from his own career over the years and the way that he approaches things. And so certainly that is conducive. And I agree with Perry, like it is not, I don't see any benefit for Canada to just be bombastic and buy into rhetoric and hype people up. I think Carney's job is to turn down the rhetoric and continue to be that quiet negotiator, play the longer game. So far, I do agree that that's been serving Canada much, much better. So he's well positioned in my view. It was interesting. We saw Pierre Poilievre, he went on a little tour of Europe the other day and met with some folks and planning to go to the US. He's trying to showcase now that he can be that international a deal maker, meeting with the right people. But the response and the reception in the U.S. has not been overly enthusiastic, especially from Republicans. And so it seems like Mark Carney is well viewed by both Democrats and Republicans as a good person to deal with. And the prime minister does seem to have the respect of the president in many respects. Yes, he's being called governor here and there, but you have to kind of see through some of that, in my opinion, and not get baited. Just continue to play your game and do it on your terms. And I think that if he does so, then he'll be in a position to hopefully be successful for all of us.
You're pulling from the hockey player script, Christian. There, can't let them play their game. We got to focus on us. Love that. I see that we're running a bit over, so I'll just skip to our final segment. I was hoping to ask both of you for your thoughts on something either you're looking forward to in the week ahead or something that maybe caught your eye in the past 7 days. I'll start with you, Christian.
Yeah, it's a good question. I was just saying that I'm a recently new second dad, or dad for the second time, I guess I should say. So I haven't left my house a whole lot in the last few weeks, but I'm looking forward to hopefully a good convention that's coming up in a couple of weeks' time in Montreal with the Liberals. Their by-election is taking place 2 days after their convention ends, and so I think there's a lot of interesting things that'll be playing out as we get to that. And I'm looking to reemerge from my period of brief absence to get fully back integrated into things. So that's what's on deck for me.
How about you, Perry?
Congratulations, Christian.
Thank you.
I just had a 3-year-old turn into a 4-year-old 2 weeks ago, and a 7-year-old turn into an 8-year-old today. So there's a big birthday month in the Sergis household. What I'm going to be watching super closely, no surprise, and maybe the obvious answer, are these by-elections. I think Terrebonne is a toss-up, but why I'm going to be watching it is not because of the will they win, will they not win. I mean, of course, we're all interested in that as political junkies, but I'm really interested in voters validating or disproving some of the polling narratives that are out there. And you're going to see some more granular writing-based polling that gets published. Some of the insiders are going to have access to some of the more granular writing-based polling that will not get published. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting bellwether. It's very geographically concentrated, mind you. So it's not necessarily the, super telling of how the entire country is feeling. But my favorite thing to do on campaigns is ground game. I just like to zero in. I love door knocking. When I was younger, I used to relish the idea of getting on the phones or door knocking. Now in my job, what I really love to do is the polling work and the focus group testing. And it's for the same reason. I just want to know what people think at the end of the day. The ultimate way they demonstrate that is in politics, how they cast their vote and how many turn out to vote. But I'm really, really keen to understand some of the more nuanced dynamics around voters' expectations with middle market housing, voters' expectations around the position we should take on the Middle East, voters' expectations around how to approach an uncertain and unpredictable Donald Trump. So it's the by-elections for me. They're a great focus group into the minds of voters and how they're feeling and what they're hopeful about, what they're anxious about, and then ultimately they're going to cast their votes and send a message. So I think that's for me, the thing I'm really keen to dive into and watch closely.
Yeah, I'm hoping we do a live blog for all the by-elections. So I'm hoping the longest ballot committee doesn't keep us past midnight. I think it was 2 or 3 a.m. with the Montreal by-elections the last time. So let's hope we don't have a repeat of that. But the thing I'm looking forward to actually is the Ontario budget. I don't know. We saw that poll, I think, that came out a few weeks ago suggesting that Doug Ford's Teflon coating may be thinning. I'm very curious to see what the response will be to the latest budget, especially if, to Christian's point, they move forward with that HST removal, which will be a pretty costly but pretty significant move on that front. I'm just, I feel like those sorts of moves, maybe they can move the needle or not, but I think I'd be very, very curious to know what the perception is of Doug Ford and how much, or his ability to kind of change people's minds based on big policy decisions. He's got a reputation, which I think is well-deserved, of being a flip-flopper on changing his mind based on what polling tells him to do. But I do wonder if he gets to the point where after, 8-9 years of Doug Ford, if he is the issue, if people are just sick of seeing this guy, sick of seeing the same rhetoric come from him, how does he adapt to that? Are we going to see, him go into the political version of a death spiral where it doesn't matter what you say or what you do, people's perception of you has calcified? So I'm very curious to see if we get a big announcement, which I assume will happen when the budget rolls out, if it will move any levers for the premier, or if, he's starting to lose some steam with voters. One poll obviously is not destiny, it could be a big outlier, but it's the first kind of signal we've seen that Doug Ford may not be as popular as we thought he was. But with that, come to the end of our show. Thank you, Christian and Perry, for joining us. And we'll be back here same time as usual next week. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, guys.